What's up, everybody? My name is Pantsface, and today we're going to talk about macros. I'm going to give you a list of some useful macros that I think will really help elevate your play, as well as talk about one that, has been in the game for so long and has such a history to it, and tell you kind of the benefits and the downsides of using it. And for those who might not be aware, I'm talking about the Nochanneling Mind Flay macro. But I'm going to save that one for the end since it's a spicy topic. Let's kick things off with the Dispersion Cancelaura macro. Now, this is really important because Dispersion lasts for 6 seconds, and during that time, you restore mana, you take 90% less damage, but you also can't cast anything. And a lot of the time, you don't want your Dispersion to last for the full 6 seconds, so we can end it early by using a Cancelaura macro. This is really important if you're dispersing on Big Bang and there's 2 seconds left on the cast, so you disperse, he casts Big Bangs, you would still have 4 more seconds of dispersion if you don't cancel it early. Same thing on Mimron, for example, if you're trying to run through fire or run through spinning up, you only need it up for a second or two, you don't need it up for the full 6 seconds. Now, the thing that I would stress about this macro is that I would not put it into your dispersion cast, because if you press dispersion twice on accident when you go to activate it, you'll instantly cancel it. So what I like to do is I pick a spell that I put my Cancelaura macro into. So for example, I have it in my Mind Blast cast. So it's the same thing as your normal regular Mind Blast, but it just has /Cancelaura dispersion added into it. It's a keybind that's far enough away from dispersion that I'm not going to misclick it by accident, but it's also pretty easily reachable so that when I do press it, I know that I'm going to cancel dispersion. Next up, let's talk about Shadowfiend attacking and its ability Shadowcrawl. I'm just going to come out and say it, Shadowfiend is a terribly designed pet. It doesn't always attack, it doesn't always use its abilities, and it's just kind of annoying, especially when it's chasing around a mob. It can be really annoying to use. This macro sets it into aggressive and has it start attacking your target immediately. What it also does, if you press it a second time, it will use its ability Shadowcrawl. This is really important because maximizing your uptime with Shadowcrawl is going to maximize your damage with Shadowfiend. It can technically cast this 3 times when it's up during its 15 seconds, but I found that if I don't do anything, like if I don't have this macro, this ability, it only casts it twice during the average cast. Now, in order for Shadowcrawl to activate on cooldown, you would have to keep pressing your Shadowfiend button every 6 seconds while it's active. If you really want to min-max it, you can take the Warlock route, which what that means is we essentially macro/cast Shadowcrawl into every single one of our abilities. Now, this is annoying to set up, but what it makes sure is no matter what spell you're casting, you will make sure that your Shadowfiend activates Shadowcrawl as soon as it has it available. I personally don't do this, just honestly because I'm lazy, but if you want to min-max your Shadowfiend, then I would highly recommend it. Next up, let's talk about Devouring Plague and Saronite Bombs. So this isn't really Shadow Priest specific, but if you want to get a little bit of extra damage throughout an encounter or just throughout a raid in general, you can macro Saronite Bombs into your Devouring Plague cast. Now, this is just the spell that I chose to put this macro into, but you could do it with any spell. I just found that I like this one the best. The important thing to know with this macro is that it's going to throw the bomb wherever your cursor is. So if you're someone who doesn't really pay attention to that, or you usually have it off on the screen somewhere, or you like to right click and you can't actually see it, you really need to pay attention to where your cursor is, because if it's behind you, it's going to throw the bomb behind you. If it's up at the ceiling, it's going to throw the bomb on the ceiling. So it's something that if you're not used to paying attention to, your bombs might not be going where you want them to. So just keep an eye out for that. Also, just note that we're using @cursor because @target does not work for this macro. You cannot throw it at your target or your target of target or your focus target. There's no way for that to work. You have to manually aim where the bomb is being thrown, which again is why we're using cursor. Now, the next one I want to talk about is a Vampiric Embrace Cancelaura. And you might be thinking, why would you ever want to cancel Vampiric Embrace? It's passive healing and it doesn't really harm anybody, right? Well, have you ever noticed on Algalon that as soon as the shadow guys spawn in phase 2 that they immediately target you? Or that during Yogg 0, after your tanks die, the guardians immediately kill you before anybody else? That's because of the passive threat that's being generated by Vampiric Embrace. Now, what I like to do is as I transition into phase 2 of Algalon or phase 3 of Yogg 0, I will cancel my Vampiric Embrace. Number one, the healing doesn't really matter for those phases, so you're not harming your raid in any way by doing this. But secondly, these mobs are no longer going to be magnetized to you. If your tanks die in phase 3 of Yogg, it means you're just going to have a few extra seconds of survivability because they'll probably be smacking around your healers instead of you. Same thing with Algalon, though if you have a big bang during that final 20%, obviously threat's going to reset and they still will target you after everybody transitions from the big bang because you'll be the only one that they have threat on. So it's not going to do anything to change that, but it just changes what happens like during the regular portions of the fight when threat is kind of normal. Now the mobs will attack whoever is highest on their threat table, so if it's not you, it would probably be a healer. So I'm not saying this is best for your raid, but it is best for your own personal DPS as it increases your survivability. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. The next macro I want to talk about is setting your max camera distance. This is something that I really value as a macro, only because the max distance that you can actually set in the WoW settings is not this far out. You'll see as I press this button, I can now scroll out a lot further. And I think this just helps generally in any raid encounter or really just anything you're doing in the game. You can see a lot more of what's around you. You can plan out your movement. You can understand where different members of your raid are. It really just allows you to understand what's happening on the battlefield so you can plan your movement a lot easier. The thing to note about this is that your camera distance is going to reset every time you log in and out. So even though you click the macro once and you can zoom fully out, if you log out and back in, your camera will still be fully zoomed out. But the second you change your camera, it's going to zoom in back to that default max distance, which is set by the game. It is a little bit annoying, but just put it on one of your action bars off to the side and just try to remember it every time you log in. All right, now the final macros I want to talk about is using equipped items. So there can be anything in your character sheet, whether it's, your rings, your trinkets, your gloves, or your boots. It's just any item that your character has equipped. Now, you can make a macro that says, if I want to use my gloves, /use Conqueror's Hand Wraps of Sanctification, which works, but it only works for that item. So instead, what you can do is you can use the number slot that I'm showing on the screen in order to use any ability that's tied to that specific slot. So for example, if I want to use my gloves, that would be /use 10. If I want to use my boots, that would be /use 8. Now, what's the point of this? Why is this better than just using the item? Well, as you upgrade gear and as you switch out gear, maybe you have different sets that you use for different specializations. You're going to be changing your gear, which means you would need a separate macro that's like /use this pair of gloves, /use that pair of gloves. By having the macro that just shows the number, that will change with your gear. So you never need to update the macro whenever you change your gear. You just leave that macro as is, you leave it on your bars, and it will update with any new gear that you get. So this is great with the engineering enhancements on different pieces of gear. It's great for trinkets. So if you always keep like your on-use trinket in the 13 spot, you know that that macro can always stay /use 13. And as long as you have an on-use macro, you can just use it with that button. It's not totally necessary, but it is a nice quality of life feature if you have multiple gear sets. Now let's talk about the no channel Mind Flay macro and why you should or shouldn't use it. So this macro has existed for almost as long as WoW has. I actually watched an old Preach video from Original Kata, and he recommended using the no channel macro in his Shadow Priest guide. So it's no wonder that this macro still has life today. So let's talk about what this macro actually does and why that might be good or bad depending on what you're trying to accomplish in the game. By using the no channeling macro, your Mind Flay will no longer interrupt itself like a normally casted Mind Flay does. This may seem like a good thing, but there are a lot of times where we want to clip our Mind Flay after 2 ticks. Less so in Wrath of the Lich King versus the Burning Crusade, but it still does happen. Now there is additional lag introduced by this macro into your cast. That's because like a normally casted spell such as Mind Blast, Shadow Bolt, Fireball, you can queue a spell into it, which means before that spell is over, you press the button of the spell you want to cast next, and then the game will immediately cast that spell once your current cast is done. But you can't do that with channel spells because obviously they just interrupt themselves. So the additional lag is introduced because the game has to recognize that the cast is finished. And once that happens, the game will then start casting your new Mind Flay. In practice, the added delay is about double whatever your ping is in game. So if you have 40 ms, it'll probably be about 80 between casts. But if you have 200 ms, it could be about 400 between casts. So if you have a really good connection, then this actually really isn't that big of a deal, and playing with this could be a DPS upgrade as long as you're okay not interrupting your Mind Flay casts. And if you wanted to, you could have 2 mind flays on your action bars. You could have one that's no channeling and then one that is a regular, just, from your spell book mind flay, that when you do want to interrupt your mind flay, you use that instead. I wouldn't recommend that personally, but I have seen people say that they do that. But if you're somebody who's in Europe playing on an American server or vice versa, or you're on the East Coast of the US playing on a West Coast server and you do have pretty high MS, then using this is really going to hurt you. So whether you want to use this macro or not really just depends on your goals for the game. If you're just trying to hang out with the guys and the girls for a few hours, have fun raiding, and you don't care that much about your DPS and you just want the game to be as easy as possible, then absolutely use this. I would recommend it in that scenario. But if you are trying to parse and you want to be 99s, 100s, do whatever you can to do your maximum DPS, then I would stay away from this macro. It's essentially like riding a bike with training wheels. It can definitely be great for new players, but if you never learn to play without it, then you're only stopping yourself from getting better at the game. But depending on your goals, that might be perfectly okay for you. But all in all, do what makes you happy. Don't worry about what the top parsing people are doing if that's not your goal. Let me know if you have any questions on the macros I put into here, or feel free to add any others that you can think of into the comments. I'd love to, fill this out with even more suggestions from the community. Anyway, I hope this guide has been helpful. My name's Pantsface, and I'll see you in the next one.